Hello and welcome to Cybersecurity, the Digital Backbone series. I'm James Riley from Innovation Oz. In this episode, which we've titled Demystifying the Price of Privilege, I'll be talking to Thomas Fikentscher, the Regional Director, Australia New Zealand for Privileged Access Management Specialist, CyberArk. So, here we are in early 2021, Thomas. Let's just recap for a minute. Like 2020 was extraordinary. I was just talking to you offline about what 2021 might look like. But last year was an extraordinary year in lots of different ways. We all know this. The work from home, the rapid digital transformation in less than ideal circumstances, and I guess you wouldn't say a lax attitude to cybersecurity, but certainly the pace at which a transformation occurred may have caused some corners to be cut. So I'm going to ask you, where did we end up? Here we are in 2021. Where did we end up in terms of that broad kind of in the cybersecurity landscape? Are we more or less secure than we were a year ago before all this started?
Yeah, James, what a year it was, 2020. I think everyone was impacted in some shape or form as an individual when you all of a sudden have a different work environment where you have to get used to. Corporations who have to work out how to actually make it all happen for in many cases, a large workforce. COVID's coming on and off, especially in Australia. You know, sometimes people were thinking, okay, I'll return back to the office, and then you're back at the home office because there was another outbreak. Governments are trying to work out what they actually can do and what they can't do in providing their services to citizens. So there was a lot of things going on. But if you think about where we ended up, are we safer? That was part of your question. I'm not sure whether we are, to be honest. I think the fact that what we always call the landscape has broadened for cyber criminality, that's still the case, right? We're getting into 2021 right now, and we have more people in home office. We have a diversified workforce. We have lots of what I call outsourced business models. We have new devices being added on a daily basis to the internet that cause security risks. So are we safer? I'm not sure. Have I seen a decline in cybersecurity breaches? Not really. I mean, think about the end of last year. Some of the most massive breaches have been publicized, like, for example, the SolarWinds one that everyone has learned about in December, which went all the way to US government agencies. And that's obviously causing some waves. So are we safer? I don't see it at the moment. I mean, we had lots of significant breaches in Australia in the last 12 months across corporations, high profile, like, Lion, BlueScope Steel, Toll Logistics. But look at government. I mean, DFAT, right? My Health Records, Transport for NSW, at local council, City of Darwin. I mean, there's so many examples. So I don't think we are necessarily safer. We still have a lot of work to do.
Certainly, it's been a tough environment, and I guess in that there's been a lot of opportunistic cyber activity, I guess, on the back of this rapidly changing environment. So, as you're looking at the threat landscape, how has it changed radically, or are you seeing the same kinds of attacks, but just in a more opportunistic way?
Some of the mechanics being used are the same. I mean, think about ransomware attacks. There's lots of them, right? But the sophistication of how they use the technology to disrupt has obviously matured. I think, follow the money trail. It's a big business right now. I mean, you can look at. I haven't been to the dark web, but I've been told very clearly that you can actually procure ransomware as a service now. I mean, this is pretty outrageous because it's becoming a business model, and obviously that attracts money and people into that space because there is money to be made. But I think there are other things that are appearing right now. We're seeing things like what they call deep fakes, where all of a sudden you're doing a phishing attack, you're trying to actually trick someone into clicking on a link, but then you follow that up with social media, and all of a sudden there's a video coming on WhatsApp when it's by an authorized person, maybe a executive, but it's not really that person who's talking to you because it's a deep fake, right? You've got things like social engineering, where more and more social engineering goes towards people who are probably very exposed, and they have very high profiles in their organizations, and people trying to really break into their maybe personal island of security in their home office. So we're seeing a little bit of more pronounced attacks, and I think that's changing. But overall, the mechanics being used, trying to steal credentials, trying to compromise identities, trying to escalate across networks, that hasn't changed. That's still the same.
Okay, let's. So we're here today to talk about privileged access management. It's an odd term. I guess it was once relegated to a kind of a realm of the highly technical. And it was. I mean, it was just privileged access management. To my limited knowledge, was just allowing systems administrators to look after systems. But today, obviously, it's a completely different thing. So firstly, I want to ask you, can't we come up with a better term for this that doesn't make it sound like there's a bunch of blokes in white coats who are running the marketing department? But what are we talking about today when we talk about privileged access management, and why is it important in the context of the kind of identity-led cybersecurity?
Okay. You're right. Privileged access management is an interesting term. It's very technical, and that's where it comes from. In its raw definition, it's typically a technical user. It's someone who actually performs some form of administrative work. And typically those users are sitting in IT departments, and they obviously have a lot of influence because they can manipulate data, they can manipulate settings. And from that perspective, they are highly privileged individuals. So the core of the whole principle comes from protecting these individuals, making sure we understand what they do, making sure you control sessions that they run in networks, making sure everything is audited, is recorded, so you actually have control and visibility. That's where it comes from. But yes, can we find a better name? So that was one of your questions. We're just moving our own organization towards a different sort of language, and we're now talking about identity security, because we believe this whole concept of privilege is now has to be applied in a much wider context. If you think about it, all of us, you, I, everyone else, performs work right now that is privileged depending on the circumstances, what you do. If you are in a finance department and you actually run report, end of year reporting, and you access financial data of a business, maybe over the last few years, that's pretty sensitive information. So while you're doing that, you're in a privileged position, right? If you are in a medical facility and you're dealing with some form of patient records or healthcare data, while you're doing that, you're in a privileged position. So we're not just talking about administration functions anymore. We're talking about a lot of business functions that are also privileged under certain circumstances. So that's where identity comes in, because identities come in all sorts of shapes and forms, and those identities have access to services, to data, to secrets, and are privileged under certain circumstances. So the security needs to wrap around identity and needs to be tailored to whatever the identity is supposed to do and perform. So yes, we're moving on in terms of language, and we're extending this whole definition across pretty much every user. And maybe there's another aspect, James, I want to mention here. Have a look at the job market right now, and look at the descriptions of how the titles are going. Everything starts with digital right now, with data. Data scientist, digital scientist, forensics this and forensic that. I mean, it's not a librarian anymore, it's cybrarian. We've got medical nanotechnologists who are actually doing tissue design and things like that. You have people who are drone operators or UAV technicians. I mean, all these individuals are now more and more dragged into performing technical work and digital work. And by the nature of that job, you're actually dealing with secrets, with data, with critical information. So for me, this thing is moving into a much, much broader context.
Okay, so let's just drill down into that a little bit. I mean, when I think about privileged access management, I know we're moving on from that, but when we talk about that, I just think of quite inflexible systems, and given the plethora of different kind of roles that that people play within their own organisations, and also interacting with third party organisations. There has to be a huge amount of flexibility about who has access to which bits of data at what time and under what circumstances. So, talk to me about the flexibility of these systems, and how and literally how they're managed in a way that doesn't become a crushing burden to the tech department.
Well, there are all sorts of systems. I mean, if you go back to legacy systems that many organizations are still using, go back to the mainframe days, or the Unix systems and those big databases that are running in organizations. They used to be highly protected environments, and only a certain amount of people had access because they knew basically the consoles that are being used. But as part of those digital transformation exercises right now, more of these systems are lifted to the surface because they need to be embedded into new business processes. So, for example, if you're in insurance and you want to have a claims management process that you allow your insurer to basically perform as a digitized service, you need to open up that database and you need to provide some form of maybe web interface or a console, and all of a sudden it becomes into visibility, right? It's the same if you do that in a banking system and you have, banking records that you want to lift to the surface because you want to provide a service where you can compare rates between different offerings. So these systems are now being lifted up and have to be managed in a different way because they're now exposed to a lot more users. So that's one topic. The second one is when you think about this outsourcing trends, everything is moving to the cloud. Well, okay, everything is moving to the cloud, and you've got the big players like Amazon, and you've got Microsoft Azure, you've got Google now with a cloud platform. But think about how many services these platforms are providing. I mean, we had a number; it was 15,000 entitlements that you actually find in these platforms. So a lot of people are now basically assigning or being assigned to these services. But how do they access them? Is that secure? Is that not secure? So that's another problem. The next problem that you have right now is IoT devices. Like people are adding more and more of these new devices and connecting them to the internet. And again, the question for me is, how are they managed? How are they being accessed? Is there a secure way? Are they segregated, or are they actually connected all the way to corporate IT? So you see this landscape is getting bigger and bigger and broader, and it has to be, because otherwise all these jobs that we discussed before, of the digital nature, they cannot be performed. So there is a big problem here, and again, privileged access exists across all of those landscapes. I mean, I have even talked about software development. Software development is the next playground. How you making sure that you develop software in an agile way very quickly and bring it into business processes, but you have to touch systems to do that. You have to disrupt maybe systems, and is a software developer a privileged user? Probably right now, by the nature of the task they're performing. So it's a very, very broad landscape, and it's multifaceted.
Okay, so when we talk about this area within the Australian context, I know we're literally not an island down here in terms of cyber issues. Where are the conversations being had that are kind of advanced, I suppose? And just as a broad statement, what do boards of directors look like now? Are you seeing conversations on boards that match the reality of the complexity of our environment now, if that makes sense?
One of the areas where I'm quite passionate about, to be honest, because I believe if you think about the severity of the issue, breaches are happening all the time, and the cost of an average breach is around $40 million. All right, that's the figures that you're dealing with right now. We had lots of damage to the Australian economy already. I mean, there's stats, right? If you think about the potential impact of cyber incidents, the Australian economy could be to the degree of 1.9% of GDP. We're talking more than $20 billion here. So if you think about the consequences at a company level or an economy level, it's pretty severe. Now, is that reflected in how the topic is being managed and handled in most of the companies? I'd say it depends on the industry you're talking to right now, James. So highly regulated industries, let's take financial services, they're probably further down the track. I mean, they've been dealing with a lot of sensitive data and financial records for a long period of time, and they've got a regulator like EPRA. And EPRA has introduced a standard like CPS 234 in 2019. Now it's being enforced. And in 2020, we saw quite a lot of organizations now saying, oh, I have an audit coming up. I need to make sure that I've actually put this in place right now because the regulator is coming after me. And I think that's reflected across the structure that they put in place. Other industries, I think they're very oblivious to the challenge. And has that gone all the way up to the board? I don't think so. I believe high-profile breaches in the last 12 months have certainly woken people up. I mean, they're happening in logistics, they're happening in manufacturing, they're happening in the consumer packaged goods space, they're happening everywhere. It has woken people up. But have boards structured themselves to deal with the problem space on an ongoing basis and fully perform assessments of digital risk? Or are they making decisions on spending lots of money on digital transformation and fully incorporate the assessment of cybersecurity as part of the digital transformation? I don't think that is fully understood. I think it's step by step happening, but there's a lot of room to get better.
Just, do you think there's a role for government here? I mean, you mentioned that the financial services sector is probably an outlier or a leader in this area, partly because it's it has regulatory forces around it that prompt those conversations. And I would I would guess that your average board of a financial services company would be more cyber literate than other boards. Perhaps that's an anecdotal observation. So is there? I don't want to get you shot by your peers, and I don't think the answer to every question is regulation. But I mean, given that we do talk more about security in relation to things like supply chains and retail and logistics and manufacturing, is there a role for a cyber regulator of some sort?
I think there is. The discussion has started. I mean, the government has put a discussion paper out for critical infrastructure bill end of last year, and I think they've received 194 submissions from all parts of the industry. So they've received submissions from companies, large companies who have something to say, like big banks and major mining companies. But they've also received submissions from universities. They've received submissions from other industry bodies, not just the financial services industry. And the government is basically saying, okay, you're going to be nominated as critical infrastructure to the Australian economy right now, and we're gonna look at how you behave. So I think the government can set a framework that allows people to operate within and understand the severity of the topic. And that's the first sort of step. Then the question is whether people are still understanding the message and then proactively approach the issue, or whether they say, no, let me wait and see, maybe they're not going to enforce it. So yeah. I think the government has certainly a role to play in showing the direction that needs to be taken, and I think the critical infrastructure bill is a good step in the right direction.
Yeah, that's that was an extraordinary response to that paper, just in terms of the submissions, and I think people are kind of defining, that they understand the problem, but kind of coming to grips with what a framework might look like. It's hard to see, but the discussion is well underway. What about in terms of like government itself has its own kind of frameworks for its own cybersecurity, but audit after audit has found that they've struggled to meet the benchmarks there. Like without coming down on government, it is a complex area to police, I suppose.
It is. I assume you're referring to something like the ASD Essential 8 that has been around for a while, and there's obviously maturity levels within the ASD Essential 8 that you can adhere to. But yeah, audit after audit, I mean, there were lots of them, WI governments, NSW governments, and the breaches happened as well. And it shows that people have either not moved to higher maturity levels or they haven't even started. And I mean, it's good that it's in place, but I think enforcing it is the key. I have seen a change. I certainly know from working with some government agencies that there is pressure in the system right now. It's been taken more seriously, and that's a consequence of the breaches that happening. So I think it's being more enforced, but I think all of that has to accelerate because we're constantly in catch-up mode, right? We're not getting on the forefront of this movement. We're still trying to react to something that's happening.
Okay, so I've just got a couple more areas. One thing I wanted to talk about, and you talked about sort of IoT and smart devices, and smart, the smart cities programs that are coming on. 5G, I guess, would have a huge impact on the way your industry works, or the way your sector, privileged access management, works. Are you expecting like an acceleration again of the forces that you're dealing with already?
5G for me is an enabler of digital services, right? It allows a lot more business models and digital models to come alive because of the pure bandwidth that it offers. I mean, think about healthcare and other areas. It allows a lot of digitization to happen right now, which was not possible before. Driverless cars, healthcare services, and so forth. With 5G comes an even further acceleration of the use of IoT devices. And I think that's the bigger problem for us because if you think about, 2019, there were about 8 billion of these devices already been installed. And I think they're expecting it to go to 30 billion over the next 10 years. So every one of these devices, so a lot of them have an IP address. Everything that is an IP address can be accessed via, obviously, the network, right, and can be compromised. So, you have a lot more access points for cyber criminality right now coming into the market. And 5G allows poorly managed devices to be connected and to create things like so-called botnets, right? What we've seen last year is what they call DDoS attacks, distributed denial of service attacks, where you actually connect IoT devices, you compromise all of that, and then you send junk to bring down service and bring down crucial services. So, yes, the technology is great to enable more and more digital services, but with that comes a lot more problems for many organizations.
Yeah, it looks like we're in for a big year. I was going to wrap up on this question. I'm just, open-ended. What are we looking at in 2021 in terms of identity management, and privileged access management? What are you expecting for the year?
As I pointed out before, we are now looking at this topic from an identity perspective and talking about identity security. And we are saying every organization needs to come up with some form of framework or a concept and say, I've got a workforce right now that is embracing more and more digital services. We're driving that into the market. And that's the same in government. If agencies providing digital services to their citizens, that's the same thing. If I accept the fact that more people now doing privileged work, then I have to look at securing these identities. I have to understand what people access. I need to understand how they access it, when they access it, and what they actually need. And if people understand that philosophy, then they basically start at the root cause of the issue. Make sure people who perform certain tasks are actually using these things in a responsible manner, in a secure manner. You have visibility and you have a level of control over what's happening in your business or in your government agency. I think that's a fundamentally big topic. And as I said before, this problem is not going to go away. The cyber attacks are going to get more sophisticated. So we need to get more sophisticated as well in terms of how we defend against that or foresee what's going to happen and use the available technology and the people in the market to actually establish a much more robust system. I think that's the number one focus for us in 2021. We are not confined anymore to the technical users. We certainly want to talk to business users. We want to talk to software development departments. We want to talk to, vendors accessing systems, like external people accessing systems. So it's a much, much broader conversation.
It's going to be a massive year, 2021, following on from an already massive year in 2020. I've been talking to Thomas Fikentscher, Regional Director for Australia and New Zealand from CyberArk. Thank you very much, Thomas. I'm James Riley. Thanks for joining us on Cybersecurity, the Digital Backbone.
Thank you, James.